Quang touches Linda's forehead, and his face changes. The fever is climbing, the baby is sleeping, and if he waits just a little longer, he could lose control of the night. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're stepping into a quiet, realistic moment many families know too well, when a simple river breeze becomes a frightening fever and Quang must choose between panic and calm. Watch how he calls for help, gets Linda to the clinic, and brings her home to the kind of care that doesn't need big words, only steady hands, warm water, and love that stays awake. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Linda didn't complain at first. She rarely did. The house was quiet in that late-night way that made every sound feel closer. Quang sat in the living room under a dim lamp, folding tiny onesies on the coffee table. The baby monitor glowed beside his elbow, their child asleep, chest rising and falling. From the bedroom, he heard a thin voice. Quang. He was on his feet before she said anything else. He crossed the hall without turning on extra lights and stepped into the room. Linda sat on the edge of the bed with the blanket gathered around her waist. Her hair was loosely tied, a few damp strands stuck to her cheek. She tried to smile, but it didn't hold. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said too quickly. "Just cold." He sat beside her and placed the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat made him pause. Linda watched his face like she could read the temperature there. "You're hot," he said quietly. "It's probably nothing," she murmured. "Maybe I'm just tired." Quang reached for the nightstand drawer and pulled out the digital thermometer. He handed it to her like it was routine. "Under your tongue." Linda hesitated, then did it. She sat still, shoulders tucked in, hands resting on her thighs. When it beeped, Quang leaned in to check the number. He didn't say it out loud. He just let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said. "We're going to take care of you." Linda's eyes flicked toward the bassinet. "Don't wake the baby." "The baby's sleeping," Quang said. "And even if the baby wakes, we'll handle it." She swallowed, her throat moving painfully. "I think it started this afternoon. I didn't want to worry you." Quang's thumb rubbed the back of her hand, steady and absent-minded. "Have you been outside much?" he asked, even though he already knew. Linda looked down. Just that time by the river. It felt nice. The air was cool. Quang didn't scold her. He remembered the breeze off the water, the brief feeling of normal. He also remembered how easily she got chilled now, how her body was still healing. He stood. "Lie back." "I'm fine," Linda tried again. Quang shook his head, gentle but firm. "You don't have to prove anything." He went to the bathroom, ran the tap until it warmed and soaked a cloth. When he returned, he wrung it out and laid it across her forehead. Linda flinched at the coolness, then sighed. "Better?" he asked. "A little." He pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, tucking it in. Then he went to the kitchen, careful with his steps. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, poured a glass of water and brought it back. "Small sips," he said. Linda drank too, then stopped. Her eyelids fluttered. "I feel dizzy." "Then we slow down," Quang said, setting the glass within reach. The monitor crackled once, then quieted. Linda's gaze followed his. "You're doing too much," she whispered. Quang turned back to her. "I'm doing what's needed." Her eyes grew wet, but she blinked fast, embarrassed. "I feel weak, like I can't even do simple things." Quang sat closer. He took her hand and held it between both of his, warming it. "You just had a baby," he said. "That's not weakness, that's recovery." Linda's mouth trembled. "I'm scared I'll get worse." Quang nodded, accepting the fear instead of brushing it away. "Right now, we do the next right thing," he said. "We cool you down, keep you hydrated, and if your fever doesn't come down, we go to the clinic. No debate." Linda nodded, a small surrender that looked like relief. Quang checked the medicine bottle in the cabinet, reading the label carefully. He placed it on the nightstand with a small glass, then went back to the kitchen and set a pot on low heat. He made a simple rice soup, warm and easy on her stomach. He sent a short message to her mother. "Linda has a fever. I'm with her. If you can come by in the morning, please." When the soup was ready, Quang carried a small bowl into the bedroom. Linda lay back now, eyes open, staring at the ceiling like her thoughts were too loud. He helped her sit up, supporting her with his arm. Linda took a few spoonfuls, then her face tightened as her appetite faded. "That's enough," Quang said, not pushing. He set the bowl aside. "You did good." Linda gave him a tired look that was half gratitude, half disbelief. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For making you worry. For being like this." Quang leaned in and kissed her forehead, careful and light. "Don't apologize for being human," he said. "You're not a problem. You're my wife." She squeezed his fingers, small and shaky. After a little food, he gave her the medicine and waited, watching her swallow, making sure she didn't feel sick. He wiped her mouth with the corner of the towel, a simple gesture that made her eyes soften. He laid her back down, adjusted the pillow and replaced the cloth on her forehead with a fresh one. He lowered the lamp until the room was mostly shadow, warm and calm. The baby stirred, a thin cry starting to build. Quang stood, went to the bassinet, and rocked it with one hand, the other resting gently on the baby's belly. The cry softened into a whimper, then stopped. He came back to Linda and sat down, his hand resting on her shoulder through the blanket. "Try to sleep," he said. Linda's eyes closed. Her breathing was uneven at first, then slowed as the medicine began to work. Quang stayed where he was, listening to the house and to the tiny sounds that meant everything. The baby's soft breaths, the occasional crackle of the monitor, Linda's exhale settling into a steadier rhythm. He didn't reach for his phone. He kept his hand on her shoulder, steady, like an anchor. When her fingers twitched in sleep, he took her hand again and held it, warm against his palm, until the tension left her brow and her face finally eased. The microwave clock glowed 5:42 when Quang realized he hadn't really slept. He'd only drifted in and out in the chair by the window, listening to the baby monitor and the small, uneven sounds of Linda's breathing. The baby fussed first, a thin whine that threatened to rise. Quang lifted him from the bassinet, kept his movements slow, warmed a bottle, and fed him in the quiet kitchen. The baby drank like nothing in the world was wrong. Back in the bedroom, Linda's eyes were open. She looked exhausted, skin flushed, lips dry. "How's he?" she whispered. "Okay," Quang said. "He's eating." Linda tried to push herself up. Her shoulders lifted, then sank as dizziness hit. Quang stepped in, palm steady on her shoulder, easing her back down. "Don't fight it," he said quietly. "I feel worse," she admitted. Her voice was hoarse. Quang took her temperature again. It wasn't going down. "We're going to the clinic," he said. Linda's eyes flicked to the bassinet. "But the baby?" "I'll handle the baby," Quang said. "And your mom can come for a bit." He sent a message first, then called. When her mother answered, Quang kept his voice low and clear. "Linda has a high fever. I'm taking her to be checked. Can you come watch the baby for a little while?" "I'm on my way," her mother said immediately. Quang moved through the house with quiet purpose. A warm cardigan, socks, a mask, water, paperwork. He set everything by the door, then came back to Linda. She watched him, eyes glossy. "It's my fault," she whispered. Quang paused. "No. The river," she said, almost like a confession. "I shouldn't have gone out like that." Quang sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, holding it between both of his. Her fingers were hot and weak. "That day gave you air," he said. "You needed it. We just underestimated the cold." Linda blinked hard, tears gathering. Quang wiped the side of her face with his thumb and stood. "Let's get you dressed," he said. When her mother arrived, she checked Linda's forehead, worry tightening her mouth, then looked at Quang. "Go," she said. "I've got him." Quang nodded. He helped Linda up, her weight leaning into him. She took careful steps down the hall, one hand on his arm, the other pressed to her stomach like it could keep her steady. Outside, the morning air felt sharp. Quang guided her into the passenger seat, buckled her in, and turned the heat on high. He draped a blanket over her lap and handed her water. "Sip," he said. Linda obeyed, then stared ahead. "I hate being like this." Quang started the car. "I know." After a moment, she asked, very small, "Are you mad at me?" Quang kept his eyes on the road. "No." "It feels tense," she whispered. Quang's hands tightened on the steering wheel, then relaxed. "That's me trying to stay steady," he said. "You shouldn't have to carry my fear too." At a red light, he reached over and squeezed her knee through the blanket. "I'm here," he said. The clinic was bright and quiet. Quang signed Linda in, answered the questions, kept a hand at her back when she swayed. They waited only a short time before a nurse called her name. In the exam room, Linda sat on the table, shoulders hunched, trying to look composed. Quang stood close enough that she could lean into him if she needed to. The nurse checked her vitals. Linda closed her eyes and breathed through it. The doctor came in with calm energy and asked about symptoms, sleep, food, and the weeks since birth. Linda answered, then faltered, her thoughts thinning. Quang filled in gently. "It worsened overnight," he said. "She's been trying to rest, but... And you're both running on nothing," the doctor finished, not unkind. She listened to Linda's lungs, checked her throat, asked about pain and anything that felt unusual beyond the fever. Then she explained the plan in practical terms. Rest, fluids, fever control that was safe postpartum, and warning signs that meant coming back quickly. Quang asked about breastfeeding and hydration. The doctor wrote it down so he wouldn't have to rely on memory. When they left, Linda looked drained but steadier. She held the paper like it mattered. In the car, Quang adjusted the heat toward her hands. "Home," he said. "Bed." Back home, her mother opened the door with the baby in her arms. The baby's cheeks were rosy, eyes wide, calm in that way that always surprised Linda. Linda's face softened. "Hi," she whispered, brushing his cheek with one finger. "He was good," her mother said. "He ate, he slept, don't worry." Linda's eyes filled. "I'm sorry," she murmured. Quang heard it. He stepped closer, voice low. "Not today." He guided Linda back to the bedroom and helped her settle under the blanket. He set up the nightstand like a small station. Water, tissues, medicine, thermometer, the clinic note. He dimmed the lamp and opened the curtains just enough to let a stripe of sunlight fall across the floor. Her mother hovered in the doorway. "Do you want me to stay longer?" "If you can stay a little," Quang said, "so I can get her down and then take the baby." She nodded. "Of course." Quang sat beside Linda and brushed her hair back from her damp forehead. Linda's eyelids fluttered. She looked at him as if she was trying to keep hold of his steadiness. "I don't know how you do this," she whispered. Quang leaned in, forehead resting lightly against hers. "One step," he said. "That's all." Linda's eyes closed. Her breathing slowed, deeper this time, like her body finally believed it was allowed to stop fighting. Quang stayed until her face softened and the tension left her jaw. Then he stood and took the baby from her mother's arms. The baby settled against Quang's chest, warm and heavy in the best way. Quang rocked gently in the doorway and looked back at Linda sleeping. He kissed the top of his son's head and whispered, barely audible, "We're going to be careful now." The baby made a soft sound and fell asleep again, and Quang kept rocking, letting the house return to its steady rhythm.
Xin chào. Trong cái lạnh cắt da của vùng cao, Linda lủi thủi một mình trên nương sắn, quanh quẩn với đàn gà, đàn vịt, căn nhà sàn cũ kỹ. Lòng lúc nào cũng thấy cô đơn, mặc cảm và bị cảm giác bị bỏ rơi. Đúng lúc đó, Quang trở về, lo lắng dặn cô không được đi vào những nơi vực sâu nguy hiểm và hứa sẽ bù đắp cho những thiếu thốn của cô. Vài ngày sau, Quang cùng người khiêng lên một chiếc tủ gỗ lớn chắc chắn đặt giữa căn nhà sàn, giúp Linda lần đầu được treo gọn quần áo, chăn màn như một người thực sự có nhà. Anh xin nghỉ làm ở lại chăm sóc, cùng nấu ăn với cô, chế củi, trò chuyện mỗi tối. Chiếc tủ mới dần trở thành biểu tượng cho tương lai vững chắc và sợi dây gắn kết âm thầm giữa hai người. Mọi người hãy like, share và subscribe để ủng hộ giúp mình nhé.